Hello, I'm Li Jianhua. Welcome to Global Business Europe. Our top stories. Major defense deals announced at the NATO summit in Ankara, from surveillance drones to short-range ballistic missiles. SpaceX rockets onto the Nasdaq just weeks after its listing, but shares come crashing down. Fuel, fertilizer and fluctuating costs. European farmers say hold-ups in the Strait of Hormuz are making it impossible to do business. And China says its artificial intelligence industry will grow by more than a third this year as the United Nations hosts talks on global AI regulation. Well, the head of NATO says nearly $220 billion of support has been mobilized for security and defense, and that this is just the beginning. Speaking at a summit in Turkey, Secretary General Mark Rutte outlined a string of big defense procurement deals, calling for a weapons industry revolution and warning that the bloc does not have the luxury of time. US President Donald Trump has long demanded that other members contribute more to the alliance. Well, those deals include allies buying US high-altitude surveillance drones, surveillance aircraft made by Swedish firm Saab, and an agreement with Washington to build short-range ballistic missiles in Germany. Rutte said NATO will launch a strategic airlift fleet of A400M transport planes. And allies will invest more than $40 billion in the next 5 years on anti-drone capabilities. At last year's NATO summit, leaders agreed to ramp up defense spending to 5% of their country's GDP by 2035, following months of pressure from President Trump. Achieving this target would require European countries and Canada to more than double what they spent in 2025. So where are we at right now? Let's take a look at some of the other countries. The UK is currently spending about 2.3% of its GDP on defence, and it's been one of the biggest challenges facing British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. But last week, his government set out plans to increase defence spending by around $20 billion over the next 4 years. Well, meanwhile, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is expected to tell the NATO summit that Rome will increase its defence spending to 2.8% of GDP in 2026, and that's around 0.7% more than last year. Well, but Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has rejected the proposal for member states to increase their defence spending to 5% of their GDP. He insists on capping Spain's at 2.1%. And NATO is reviewing defence spending figures from the Czech Republic, Slovenia and Albania. All three say that they met the alliance's previous target, 2% of their GDP, but have been asked to resubmit their data for verification. Well, Ben Farrell is Global CEO of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, and also a former British Army Colonel. Ben, great to have you on the show. So the issue of funding hung really heavy over the NATO summit. How much of a hindrance is this?
Yeah, clearly it is very much in the forefront of everybody's minds in today's conference. But it was clear that when the Secretary-General spoke this morning, he was keen to stress the progress and the commitment that we're seeing in a lot of nations really beginning to step up. You know, and I've seen firsthand, I've been to many of the European capitals, and it's quite right to highlight those who are not, you know, at the moment, obviously meeting their obligations, but many nations clearly are and have the intention to step up and commit to the growth in defence expenditure. I can see from the defence procurement community around Europe how more and more nations are leaning into this and going to, you know, certainly express the intention of increasing their GDP expenditure on defence, as the evident threat from Russia is clear in everybody's mind.
Well, Ben, I also want to talk about the UK. The UK's outgoing Prime Minister Keir Starmer arrived with no long-term plan, apparently. Do you think that he is on a collision course with President Trump again?
Well, it's a very good question. Clearly, the defence investment plan that was long awaited in the United Kingdom was indeed published recently, and there were one or two areas where people are questioning the affordability of some of it and where the money was coming from. So there has been a published plan, to be fair, and there have been certainly the intention expressed within the Ministry of Defence to meet these levels of spending commitment. So to some extent, he's taken a deliberate step in that direction, perhaps before leaving office. And that may well be an articulation of the intention longer term, and to avoid the confrontation potentially with President Trump. I think to some extent, I'm not sure the concentration of the summit's really going to be beyond that. But the United Kingdom has made a clear commitment to be at 3.5% of GDP by 2028, increasing to 5%. So I think, that's a clear commitment. The question is now, is the delivery of that commitment.
And apart from the defense deal, Iran, the wider Middle East conflicts and the Ukraine-Russia war apparently are expected to be discussed, but the issues are more than just about defense issues now, aren't they? We have just seen how much conflicts affect supply chains holding the rest of the world to ransom, apparently, now.
No, it is. And we've recently done a survey, and the level of anxiety amongst supply chain professionals around the world is a sort of high water mark. It's receded slightly in the last few months. But what's happened, and we can see this has happened, is to some extent, the supply chains have been weaponized. The ability to constrain supply through the Strait of Hormuz were new phenomena. I was recently in the ASEAN region, and for the very first time, I'm not saying it is an imminent threat, but people were talking about the Strait of Malacca, 24 million barrels of oil going through there on a daily basis. And the first time ever, people have recognised, the way that global trade flows is in itself a vulnerability, and the prospect of that being increasingly constrained and weaponised is a reality of the world we live in today. So supply chains are increasingly at the vanguard, the forefront of the conversation about national security and resilience.
And your recent survey, you mentioned that just now, saw a very small drop in anxiety from procurement leaders, but it's still very high, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And that has been growing and growing over the last few years. And we're not just talking about the obvious recent impact of the war in Iran. We're talking about a compound effect over a number of years, whether it was through originally the war in Ukraine, and then the tariffs changed. So progressively, I think the reality of where we are in global supply has been ever more recognised, and the vulnerability of that. So 4 decades of globalisation have taken us to a place where cost was the preeminent driver of supply chains, and increasingly people are thinking now about the vulnerability or the lack of resilience in some of these supply chains. So this is why increasing supply chain professionals are being looked to in organisations to provide the answer, to provide continuity of supply, and increasingly they're anxious about the ability to do that with the level of disruption we've seen in recent months.
Thank you very much, Ben, for your insight. Thank you. But SpaceX is being added to the Nasdaq less than a month after its stock market debut. It follows the rule changes allowing newly listed companies to be fast-tracked into wisely tracked benchmarks. Our correspondent Kate Fisher is in Washington. Kate, great to see you. So a lot of money, more money I have to say, set to flow into SpaceX, and lots of people are set to become automatic investors. Now, I think its share is around $150.
Yeah, that's right. This change to NASDAQ's rules has allowed very large, newly listed companies to qualify for entry within a matter of days instead of waiting for months, meaning that passive funds that track the NASDAQ 100 must buy SpaceX shares, so their portfolios continue to match that index. So this isn't actually like an investment choice by the fund managers, it's part of the mandate. Reuters estimates that more than $4 billion of passive buying could result from SpaceX's inclusion on the NASDAQ, and it means that many people are becoming indirect investors, as you mentioned. And so if you own a NASDAQ 100 index fund or an exchange-traded fund, you'll now own a small slice of SpaceX automatically. So that means that millions of retirement savers and pension fund members will gain exposure to SpaceX, whether they want to or not, without placing any kind of order themselves. And while this kind of force buying can create short-term demand, history shows it can often be temporary. Some analysts note SpaceX's share price hasn't experienced a big boost simply because it joined this index, and that provisional result disappointing for investors who thought that this automatic index buying would boost those shares.
Yeah. And Kate, meanwhile, Meta could be facing a huge bill over allegations that it is making its platform deliberately really addictive and issued false safety measures. So what more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, you're right. Meta is facing a substantial legal exposure over this. The outcome, though, is still uncertain. The company is defending, though, thousands of lawsuits here in the US brought by individuals, school districts, and some state attorneys general. And their central allegations are that Meta knowingly designed features on platforms like Facebook and Instagram to maximize user engagement in ways that can be addictive, particularly for teenagers, and that it misrepresented or understated the potential mental health risks and the effectiveness of the safety measures that it implemented. Now, the plaintiffs are arguing that these practices caused anxiety, depression, sleep disruption, some eating disorders and compulsive use of social media. It's been denied by Meta. They argue that their products are not inherently addictive and that it invests heavily in parental controls and safety tools. And they also say there's no scientific consensus proving that these platforms cause these mental health harms. And they say that parents and the users are the ones that are ultimately responsible for how these services are used. Now, the potential liability in terms of costs could be huge if Meta is to lose one of these major cases or have to agree to a broad settlement. But it is too early to estimate that kind of cost. These kind of huge mass litigation like what happened with the tobacco industry can take many years to resolve. But separately, Meta's also faced other regulatory scrutiny over child safety and privacy here in the US and in Europe, and that's they're
exactly,
distinct
Kate. There are a lot of American companies that are facing the same problem.
Could cause a bit big.
Kate, exactly. A lot of American companies, especially some companies like Meta and YouTube, they had the same issue in America. On a slightly different note, a group of states' attorneys have called proposed tariffs on countries over forced labor allegations unlawful. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is a coalition of 22 Democratic states attorney general who formally objected to the Trump administration's proposal to impose these new tariffs on imports from 59 countries and the European Union. And they're saying it's because of allegations that those jurisdictions haven't done enough to prevent goods made with forced labour from entering global supply chains. And the proposed tariffs would be 10% on imports from 16 countries and 12.5% on 44 other countries, and they would cover 99.4% roughly of all the US imports from those affected economies. That's according to the US Trade Representative. Now, the Attorneys General say that USTR is stretching its authority, which it says is under Section 301 of the Trade Act, which is intended to address unfair foreign trade practices. It says not to impose broad tariffs on nearly all imports from so many countries. They say there is not a big enough link between these tariffs and the forced labour that it is intended to stop. Essentially, the tariffs are so broad, they're not targeting the problem they're supposedly addressing. And they say instead this is the Trump administration trying to replace the earlier tariffs that were, of course, struck down after the US Supreme Court ruled the administration lacked the authority to impose them under emergency powers. But the USTR argues that its investigations found widespread failure to combat forced labour in the supply chains, and therefore these additional tariffs are appropriate. We still don't have a final decision on that. Public hearings on the proposal are underway, and no court has yet ruled on the legality of this specific proposal.
Well, thanks, Kate. That is our correspondent Kate Fisher in Washington. Well, shares in Samsung have plunged despite the electronics giant forecasting a 19-fold annual jump in profit. Stocks fell as much as 10% on Tuesday, with investors increasingly concerned about unsustainable tech bubble. Preliminary results from the second quarter show operating profits of more than $58 billion, driven largely by AI chip sales, equates to an annual profit rise of 1,800%. But Ford is recalling over 110,000 Mass-Town vehicles in the United States due to safety issues. Some of the recalls are due to faulty windscreen wipers, while the others require adjustment to the rear drive chain to prevent losses of power or unintended vehicle movement. Drivers will not be charged for the work. The European Union entry system is being delayed until next year. That's according to reports in the British newspaper The Financial Times. Under the system known as ETIAS, visa-exempt travellers would need to register before entering the bloc of 27 countries. A separate electronic border check introduced earlier this year has been causing chaos at airports across the continent. But China and Norway say they are ready to expand cooperation in green transition and technology. It comes as the Chinese foreign minister wraps up a full-nation visit of Nordic countries. Our correspondent Johannes Pleshberger spoke to the Norwegian Prime Minister to hear his views on China.
Well, when I was in Beijing in late 24, we agreed on a strategic work together on the green transition. It can be on shipping, can be on ocean management, on technologies. And the foreign minister had also an exchange on this, and we want to take that forward. I mean, China is leading a lot of the transitions on renewable energy. Norway is also renewable energy potential. We have technologies in carbon capture and storage. So here we want our scientists and our companies to cooperate and work together. There are many activities going on from the research field to the operational field between companies. I would say shipping is one such important area where my Minister of Shipping will have direct contact with her counterpart to take that forward. Many of the ships now in the world are being built in China, but a lot of the technology inside those ships come from Norway, and that's a good thing.
Well, this is Global Business Europe still ahead. From the waters of the Middle East to the fields of France, how the hold-ups in the Strait of Hormuz are affecting the price of food and the world over. Hello and welcome back to Global Business Europe. It's Li Jianhua. The headlines again. Major defense deals announced at the NATO summit in Ankara, from surveillance drones to short-range ballistic missiles. SpaceX rockets onto the Nasdaq just weeks after its listing, but shares come crashing down. Well, 2 crude oil tankers have been damaged near the Strait of Hormuz after Iran reportedly fired at ships overnight. A Qatari natural gas tanker suffered engine damage after being hit by a drone. A Saudi-flagged ship was also damaged off Oman's coast. Well, this latest incident follows months of blockages in the waterway, but it's not only oil that's being affected. Around a third of the world's fertilizer normally passes through Hormuz, and the price fluctuations are impacting European farmers. Our correspondent Sarah Coates reports from France.
In the fields of northeast France, the harvest is already underway. But for 64-year-old Jean-Francois Sauvage, the pressure on his farm is no longer just coming from the weather. After 40 years here, he knows every harvest comes with risk. But this season, global markets and the prices of fuel and fertiliser are all fluctuating at once, leaving farmers with big decisions to make.
3 or 4 years ago, wheat was selling for €250 per tonne and barley for 300. This morning, wheat is 180 per tonne. And on top of that, with this heatwave, we're going to lose some of the good crop.
For grain farmers, fertiliser can make or break a harvest, and its cost can change rapidly due to issues thousands of kilometres away.
So ammonia and urea, and especially urea, are significantly produced in the Middle East and then traded from there. About 30% of globally traded urea comes out of the Gulf. And because it's such a large and global market, any loss of supply like that impacts farmers across the world.
The concern now is what happens next. Even if the traffic through the vital shipping route, the Strait of Hormuz, returns to pre-war levels, the effects of its closure could be lasting.
You are seeing globally increased prices, and warehouses across the world will take that signal and raise their prices as well. And that's not because the stuff in warehouse is more expensive than it was the day before, but what they have to buy to replace it will be. So they need to keep up with market prices.
And while Europe doesn't source all of its fertiliser from the Gulf, the price farmers pay is shaped by global markets, meaning a disruption thousands of kilometres away can still be felt here on this farm. On farms like this, every decision about fertiliser matters. Use too little and yields can fall. Pay too much and farm margins can be squeezed. For Jean-Francois, the real pressure is the uncertainty. Every decision has to be made before he knows whether prices will rise or fall.
The price of nitrogen fertiliser has more than doubled, so these days you never know when you're going to sell or when you're going to buy, or whether you made the right decision or not.
For now, the harvest continues, but the decisions being made now are already about next season. What to plant, how much fertiliser to buy, and how much risk he's willing to take on. Sarah Coates, CGTN, France.
Well, for more insight now, let's speak to Peter Alexander, Professor of Global Food Systems at the University of Edinburgh. Professor Alexander, great to have you on the show. So the Strait of Hormuz is not only important for energy supplies, but apparently also for agriculture.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So agriculture is very dependent on the fossil fuel sector. Since the Green Revolution, we use a lot of inorganic fertilizer, inorganic nitrogen being the most widely used fertilizer, and that's produced from natural gas primarily, and sometimes coal, through the harbour wash process. And obviously, because of the abundance of fossil fuels in the Gulf region, obviously they are a major player in production of urea, which is the major form of inorganic nitrogen fertilizer, and you know, as you said, as the person who was part of that package correctly said, roughly a third of urea passes through the Straits of Hormuz in normal times, and that obviously has been disrupted with this conflict. The one thing that was exactly correct. It's not true to say that a third of urea on the kind of global supply of urea is from the Gulf, because a lot of urea is produced and consumed actually in the same country. Because all you really need is that natural gas and the facilities to do it. There's no kind of other natural resource you require. So it's more like something like 10% of, maybe a little bit less, of urea is actually supplied through the Gulf, or from the Gulf.
Well, Professor, I think for a lot of viewers who are currently watching, they are just concerned how much that will increase food prices at the end of the day. In the supermarkets, when do we see that reflected? Yeah,
so absolutely. And there's two kind of obvious, well, two kind of clear mechanisms that increase in food prices is likely to occur through. The first is, if you like, is a direct mechanism. You know, if farmers' input costs go up because the fertilizer they need to use to produce the crops increase in price, then that's passed through eventually to consumers. But there's a sort of an indirect mechanism that's actually probably more important and maybe slightly less obvious, which is that, you know, farmers might choose to not establish those crops, or maybe to fertilize less, and then as a result of those type of decisions, there's less supply of food entering the market. And that also feeds through to much higher, or potentially much higher, food prices if that occurs at a great scale, because obviously we've got similar demand chasing sort of less supply. So that sort of indirect change in farmer choices, farmer behaviour, leading to sort of lower production of food is really a concern. There's a lead time involved in that. You know, as you heard in your package, farmers are always have to make decisions ahead of time. You know, what crops to plant. At planting season, that it was harvested 6, 9, 12 months later, depending on what they're growing and where. So the sort of issues kind of get baked into the system based on the context, the market context in which many people are making decisions around the world. So yeah, it's a complex system.
It is rather complex, and I'm afraid that we're all concerned about food prices already. Okay, thank you very much. That is Professor Peter Alexander from the University of Edinburgh. Thank you very much for your insight. And China's artificial intelligence industry is expected to grow by more than 30% this year. China's top economic planner says that the annual shipments of AI-powered smart devices including AI smartphones and computers, surpassed 100 million units in 2025, with strong growth expected to continue this year. Well, the United Nations is hosting the first high-level global dialogue on AI governance. The gathering in Geneva hopes to find ways that international communities can work together as AI reshapes economies and society. Our correspondent Julia Hamilton has more.
Artificial intelligence is advancing faster than regulation, and the world is trying to keep up. The United Nations has brought together governments, international organizations, and field experts in Geneva to discuss AI governance, covering AI opportunities and risks, bridging AI divides, international cooperation, and human oversight of AI systems.
And we have seen different member states all around the globe which are introducing now already AI governance structures, and therefore also the learning from each other, being better together by joining forces. This is one of the key parts of these days here in Geneva.
Beijing is represented by Minister of Industry and Information Technology, Li Lisheng. Addressing the dialogue, he called for stronger international cooperation on AI governance, saying all countries should have an equal opportunity to develop and benefit from artificial intelligence. China has consistently backed the UN as the main platform for global AI governance and says it wants to help bridge the global AI divide. Some of China's leading AI experts are also attending the event.
We need a platform that put all the considerations all together to find the consensus interoperability. Instead of competing with each other, you find a way to connect with each other and to learn from each other. So the next step is that really to use the platform like this global dialogue on AI governance, like the UN General Assembly, to solve problems based on these discussions.
Following the high-level segment, industry experts and academics took part in thematic sessions and various side events to discuss potential benefits as well as bottlenecks in AI governance.
Governments and officials here agree that artificial intelligence is advancing at extraordinary speed. But building international consensus takes far longer. Here in Geneva, the United Nations hopes to provide a platform where governments can begin shaping common rules for one of the world's most transformative technologies. Whether that consensus can be achieved remains one of the defining questions of the AI era. Julia Hamilton, CGTN, Geneva.
Well, the headlines again. Major defense deals announced at the NATO summit in Ankara, from surveillance drones to short-range ballistic missiles. SpaceX rockets onto the Nasdaq just weeks after its listing, but shares come crashing down. That is for Global Business Europe. See you again tomorrow, same place, same time. From all the team in London, goodbye.